Morning. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's Hove, and welcome to the Book of Wisdom. Welcome to our 218th step in our walking tour through the Bible. Now, the Book of Wisdom is unusual. First of all, it was not written in Hebrew, it was written in Greek. Secondly, it is the last book of the Old Testament to be written, even though it's not at the end of the Old Testament. And thirdly, it was not written in the Holy Land, it was written in Egypt, probably in the capital of Egypt, in Alexandria, by a Jewish person living in the diaspora. By the time the Book of Wisdom came to be written, roughly 50 BC, maybe a bit before, by this time there were more Jews living outside the Holy Land than were living in the Holy Land, and the center of gravity of Jewish life and Jewish thought had shifted to Alexandria. Jerusalem by that time was something of a backwater. Now, what was going on in Alexandria at that time? This is important actually for understanding the Book of Wisdom. Well, the person ruling Alexandria was Ptolemy the 11th brackets Auletes. His real name was Ptolemy Neo-Dionysios something something something, Philopator, Soter or something like that. They all had very elaborate names. They're all called Ptolemy, but they all had various other elaborate names. But he was known as Auletes, which, as you know, is the Greek word for the flute player. It turned out that he was quite a good flute player, but he was an absolutely dreadful king. And he lost the throne, and he was the one who essentially handed Egypt over to the Romans. He was the father of Cleopatra the Seventh, the famous Cleopatra, the Cleopatra we all know about, the one who was the mistress of Antony and, in fact, Julius Caesar. Now, Ptolemy Auletes was the most dreadful, dreadful, dreadful king. And and in Alexandria, there were huge tensions between the Greeks and the Jews. Now, the people who lived in Alexandria in those days were, I suppose we might think of them as Egyptians, but they thought of themselves as Greeks. Ptolemy was a Greek king. He was a descendant of one of the successors of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy and indeed Cleopatra probably couldn't even speak the Egyptian language. All their culture was completely Greek, and they were 100% Greek by birth, even though we don't know who Ptolemy's mother was, but we think she was probably a concubine from Athens. Anyway, let's not get dragged into this family gossip. Rather, let's try and understand the opening words of the Book of Wisdom. Love uprightness, you who are rulers on earth. Be properly disposed towards the Lord and seek him in simplicity of heart. For he will be found by those who do not put him to the test, revealing himself to those who do not mistrust him. So the opening line is a rebuke to the rulers of the earth. It's a rebuke addressed clearly with Ptolemy Auletes in mind, saying, you most dreadful pagan kings, you really are the worst. You should seek God and seek wisdom. Now, one of the things is that the first 5 chapters of the Book of Wisdom is doing is it's an exercise in what's called theodicy. That is to say, an exercise in looking at the situation as it is and trying to justify the ways of God to man. Saying, how is it that these ghastly people like Ptolemy Auletes rule the world's most sophisticated and rich city? And we, who follow the Lord, the Jews, are groaning under their tyranny, treated like second-class citizens, because that would have been the case. So it talks about those who seek good and those who are clearly pagans and contrasts the two. And it essentially puts forward the idea that the pagans are flourishing and the virtuous, the true believers, are not flourishing. And how is this the case, that God has allowed this? The answer to the question, and there is an answer to the question, is this, that there is such a thing as eternal life, and there is such a thing as the judgment of God. God will judge the ungodly, and he will judge the godly. The ungodly will be punished in the next life. The godly will be rewarded in the next life. Justice will be done, but justice will be done in the next life. Now, this is revolutionary. First of all, the Book of Wisdom assumes that the soul is immortal, and therefore that when we die, we live on. It doesn't actually talk about a physical resurrection, but it does talk about the immortality of the soul. And it also says that God is a judge who will judge us according to what we did on earth, whether we were faithful to his word or whether we were bad people and pagans. This is very important because we haven't really had explicitly until now the immortality of the soul, and we haven't had explicitly until now in the Bible this idea of the final judgment, the judgment of God that comes after death. These are things that we as Christians take for granted, but they weren't taken for granted in the time of the Old Testament. In fact, it is a late doctrine that develops in the Old Testament. Now, of course, I know that the book of the Psalms talks about hell and so on and so forth. It may well have been talking about Gehenna, that very famous rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, Jerusalem's own smoky mountain. We interpret many of the Old Testament passages to be about the afterlife, but they can also be interpreted in different ways. So he talks about in the first chapter the good and the bad. The good are talked about in the first chapter, and the bad are libertines. If you look at chapter 2, verses 1, the libertines say, our life is short and dreary. There is no remedy when our end comes. No one is known to have come back from Hades, so there's no afterlife, they say. We came into being by chance, and afterwards we shall be as though we had never been. Well, we hear this nowadays. This is a common argument nowadays, isn't it? The breath in our nostrils is puff of smoke, reason a spark from the beating of our hearts. Extinguish this, and the body turns to ashes. In other words, they say that life is purely physical, thought is purely physical. There's nothing that survives death. In time, our name will be forgotten. Nobody will remember what we have done. Our life will pass away like wisps of cloud, dissolving like the mist, etc. Then it says, well, what are we going to do? Come then, let's enjoy the good things of today. Let us use created things with the zest of youth, take our fill of the dearest wines and perfumes, on no account forego the flowers of spring, etc. So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die, and there is no afterlife. Now, one of the things about Alexandria in those days, it was the center of, it was the Las Vegas of its day. It was the center of the universe. It was the most sophisticated place on earth. Rome was a cultural backward compared to Alexandria. And Alexandria is the place where Antony and Cleopatra, remember them, formed the Society of Inimitable Livers. In other words, they dedicated themselves to every pleasure that life could offer. And author, who's probably writing before Antony and Cleopatra, but that sort of thing was already going on in his time, says this is all wrong. This is all wrong. We should concentrate and remember that this is the way they reason, he says, chapter 2 to verse 21. But they are misled, since their malice makes them blind. They do not know the hidden things of God. They do not hope for the reward of holiness. They do not believe in the reward for blameless souls. For God created human beings to be immortal. He made them as an image of his own nature. Death came into the world only through the devil's envy, as those who belong to him find to their cost. Now, the immortality of the soul is taken as read because the very existence of the soul posits its immortality. The soul being immaterial, it cannot decay, therefore it must be immortal. And of course, death came into the world through the devil's envy. Here, he's thinking of the book of Genesis, and he's identifying that snake, the serpent, with the devil. And of course, Adam and Eve would have lived forever if it hadn't been for the sin that they committed. Now, then in chapter 3, he goes on to talk about the good and how the good live forever. And this is the passage we often have at funerals. The souls of the just are in the hands of God. No torment can ever touch them. The unenlightened, they appear to die. Their departure was regarded as disaster. They're leaving us like annihilation, but they are at peace. If, as it seemed to us, they suffered punishment, their hope was rich without immortality. Slight was their correction. Great will their blessings be. God was putting them to the test, and he has proved them worthy to be with him. He has tested them like gold in a furnace and accepted them as a perfect burnt offering. So the just, the Jews living in Alexandria in this case, even though they seem to be punished in this life, will be rewarded by God and they will live forever. Whereas the people who are having a great time out there, the pleasure lovers, they will find with a nasty shock that they'll be punished in the next life. For he says, verse 10 of chapter 3, But the godless will be duly punished for their reasoning, for having neglected the upright and deserted the Lord. Yes, wretched are they who scorn wisdom and discipline. Their hope is void, their toil unavailing, their achievements unprofitable. Their wives are reckless, their children depraved, and their descendants accursed. In other words, the inimitable livers, the pleasure lovers, the libertines, these ones who seem to be having such a great time, they are completely mistaken about everything and they are going to be punished. So that is the purpose of the Book of Wisdom. I've got up to the third chapter, but you can look at um, the fourth and fifth chapters. Basically, repeat the same thing. So we've got two groups of people: those who seem to be prosperous, those who are virtuous and not prosperous, but the not prosperous, virtuous ones are the ones who are going to triumph in the end. And that explains that beautiful reading we often have at funerals. So. For he concludes, chapter 5, verse 15, but the upright live forever, their recompense is with the Lord, and the Most High takes care of them. So they will receive the glorious crown and the diadem of beauty from the Lord's hand, for he will shelter them with his right hand, and with his arm he will shield them. So that's, well, us, the religious people. For armor he will take jealous love, etc., etc. As for the wicked, what's going to happen to them? Of his pitiless wrath he will forge a sword, and the universe will march with him to fight the reckless. Bolts truly aim, the shafts of lightning will leap from the clouds as they. So this is the final judgment. The waters of the sea will rage against them, the rivers engulf them without pity. This is the wicked. A mighty gale will rise against them and winnow them like a hurricane. Thus wickedness will lay the whole earth waste, and evil doing will bring down the thrones of the mighty. So at the last judgment, justice will finally be done. We'll look at the rest of this later at another day. All the very best. Bye.